In our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, April 11th, here in South Korea. Liberal opposition parties look to take the helm of the 22nd National Assembly following Wednesday's parliamentary election, which also saw a record voter turnout at 67%, the highest in 32 years. And main opposition Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung welcomes the result of the race, calling it a victory for the people, while ruling People Power Party interim leader Han Dong-hoon tenders his resignation, taking responsibility for the party's defeat. US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida share their condemnation of North Korea's hostile weapons ambitions while calling on the regime to return to dialogue. We begin on the local front today. The country's 22nd parliamentary election came to a close on Wednesday with victory for Liberal opposition parties. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-woo starts us off.
The counting of ballots to decide the 22nd National Assembly of South Korea is now complete. According to National Election Commission, out of 254 possible seats representing local districts, the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea took 161, the ruling People Power Party 90, while there was one seat each for the minor Saemildae, New Reform, and Jinbo parties. As for the 46 proportional representation seats, the PPP satellite People Future Party secured 18 seats, while the DP satellite party, the Democratic United Party of Korea, including candidates from the Jinbo party, secured 14. From minor camps, the Rebuilding Korea party launched by former Justice Minister Cho Guk won 12 seats, while the New Reform party, led by the former PPP leader Lee Jun-seok, won 2. This means that in total, the DP and its satellite occupy more than the majority of the new assembly with 175 seats. That's 58.3% of all seats in the parliament. Moving forward, the DP may have additional support in parliamentary procedures from 14 other minor opposition lawmakers elected, representing the Saemildae, Rebuilding Korea, and Jinbo parties. Meanwhile, the PPP and its satellite will occupy a total of 108 seats. That's 36% of overall representation. The PPP may have support in parliament from 3 representatives elected from the New Reform Party. The DP won in many of the capital districts, taking victory in several key battlegrounds along the so-called Hangang River Belt. Traditionally liberal Jeolla-do provinces and traditionally battleground Chungcheongdo province voted in favor of the main opposition. Meanwhile, the PPP won fewer seats in the capital region but did secure traditionally conservative districts in Gangnam-gu. Historically conservative Gyeongsangdo province also voted mostly in favor of the ruling party. This distribution isn't vastly different from the previous 21st Assembly elected 4 years ago. As we've seen in the previous large opposition, small ruling parliament, the opposition now has the opportunity to take control of parliamentary moves with its numbers, leaving the Yoon administration without the momentum needed to push through its objectives. Lee Si-woo, Arirang News.
And political parties have shared their official response to the latest election result. For this, I have my colleague Shin Ha-young standing by live on the line at the National Assembly. Ha-young, let's begin with the reaction from the main opposition party.
Sunny, following cheers and applause for exit polls yesterday, there weren't any new official remarks from the main opposition Democratic Party regarding the overall vote count until just a few hours ago. And around 4 hours ago, the DP leader Lee Jae-myung, who is also the co-chair of the election campaign committee, said that the results of this year's general election are not the party's victory, but the victory of the people. Take a listen.
The election results are not a victory for the Democratic Party, but a great victory for our people. We will do our best to alleviate the people's hardships and resolve national crises. We will lead the 22nd National Assembly to protect the people now and open up a better tomorrow for them.
His remarks came during the final meeting of the DP's election campaign committee. He began his speech by thanking the public for their support in helping the party secure more than its target of at least 151 seats. And he urged party members to remain humble and attentive to the voices of the voters even after the election.
Right, and Ha-young, what has been the response from the ruling party?
Well, Sunny, up until 11 a.m., the only comment from the ruling People Power Party came from its interim leader Han Dong-un yesterday, who made a statement before leaving the party's headquarters after checking the early exit polls. And during the press conference on Thursday, Han announced his decision to resign, taking responsibility for the party's defeat in the election. Take a listen.
The public sentiment is always right. I apologise to the people as the representative of our party, which has failed to gain their support. I accept the voters' will and reflect deeply. Therefore, I take full responsibility for the election outcome and resign from my role as the chairman of the Emergency Leadership Committee.
Han stated that he takes full responsibility when asked about the cause of the defeat. And regarding future plans, he said he doesn't have any specific plans, adding that he will continue living with concern for the country regardless of his location or role. And during his speech, Han congratulated all elected officials, including those from opposition parties, and urged for politics that reflect the people's will. And right after Han's press conference, the PPP's Park Jong-ha also stepped down as chief spokesperson. That's all after this hour. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, Ha-young, thank you for that coverage. That was our political correspondent Shin Ha-young reporting live from the National Assembly. Meanwhile, President Yoon Suk-yeol will humbly uphold the result of the latest parliamentary race. His remarks to this end were relayed to reporters earlier on this Thursday by Chief of Staff Lee Kwan-sup, who added the president's commitment to state affairs and to stabilizing livelihoods. Separately, all senior aides at the top office, excluding those in the National Security Council, have voiced their intentions to resign. Senior staff members include the Chief of Staff, the Chief of Staff for Policy, and all senior secretaries. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo has also offered to resign. The latest parliamentary race saw its highest voter turnout in well over 30 years. Our PNG covers this finding.
The voter turnout rate for this year's election was 67%. According to the National Election Commission, out of about 44 million eligible voters, nearly 30 million Koreans have cast their ballots at polling stations nationwide to elect 300 lawmakers at the National Assembly. This is the highest figure in 32 years since 1992, when 70% voter turnout was recorded. In fact, the turnout for early voting, which took place last week from Friday to Saturday, reached 31.28%, marking the highest early voting turnout for general elections since it was first implemented in 2014. Almost half of the early voters were those in their 50s and 60s, followed by those in their 40s and 70s. This comes after the ruling party and the main opposition party leaders have repeatedly urged voters to cast their ballots.
Consolidation of support from a conservative party and a progressive party, that too is reflected in the voter turnout. It seems that it was important which side went out to vote more.
The high voter turnout also comes after the country decided to disclose the real-time status of early voting ballot boxes to the public using CCTV cameras, further encouraging voters to cast their ballots. 배은지, Arirang News.
In Washington, back on Wednesday, U.S. President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida shared their condemnation of North Korea's hostile weapons ambitions while calling on the regime to return to dialogue. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
U.S. President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met for a summit at the White House on Wednesday, where the two leaders discussed an array of issues related to North Korea. In the joint statement issued after the talks, Biden and Kishida reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of North Korea in accordance with relevant UNSC resolutions, while also condemning North Korea's continued development of its ballistic missile program, including through launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles using ballistic missile technologies, which poses a grave threat to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. The two leaders also reaffirmed their openness to holding talks with North Korea.
We both agree that DPRK must also address the serious human rights and humanitarian concerns of the international community, including the immediate resolution of the abduction issue. But you know, the Prime Minister has just spoken to the potential, what his plans may mean. But I welcome the opportunity, we welcome the opportunity of our allies to initiate dialogue with the Democratic Republic of Korea.
In their joint statement, the two leaders also called on North Korea to return to dialogue without precondition. However, the North has stressed that any summit between Kim Jong-un and Kishida will be held without discussions on Japanese abductees and the denuclearization of the regime. They also expressed concerns over growing cooperation between North Korea and Russia, while calling for faithful enforcement of anti-Pyongyang sanctions, despite Moscow's veto of a UNSC resolution to extend the mandate of an expert panel monitoring sanctions implementation. During Wednesday's summit, the two leaders also announced an array of agreements, including upgrading their country's command and control structures, creating an air defense architecture between the U.S., Australia, and Japan, and deepening people-to-people exchanges. Biden also stressed the improved relations between Seoul and Tokyo, saying President Yoon Suk-yeol decided to heal all wounds and start a new chapter of friendship. 이승재, Arirang News.
Staying with summits, the leaders of South Korea, neighboring Japan and China are likely to sit down here in Seoul in late May. Now, this is according to Japan's Yomiuri Shimbun back on Wednesday in a report that claimed the summit may take place on the 26th or 27th of May. Trilateral summit talks were last held in Chengdu, China, some 4 years ago, but have since been stalled owing to the COVID-19 pandemic and tensions between Japan and South Korea, as well as those between Japan and China. This latest report by the Japanese newspaper is on par with revelations by a source to Arirang News earlier this month about a trilateral summit in the Korean capital city in May. Meanwhile, the Korean economy is expected to expand 2.2% this year. Now, this is according to the Asian Development Bank, and Seoul's finance ministry says this latest projection reflects that of the government here. Our Yoon has details.
Seoul's finance ministry said on Thursday that the Asian Development Bank has maintained its outlook for this year's growth at 2.2%. This outlook is on par with what the government had forecast in December. The ADB also forecasts growth for 2025 to be 2.3%. Based on the ADB's analysis, Korea is benefiting from growth in the global artificial intelligence sector, which has led to a recovery in the semiconductor industry. It has benefited even more than other semiconductor powerhouses like Taiwan and China, where chip production takes up a relatively lower proportion of exports. The ADB also kept its outlook for South Korea's inflation this year at 2.5%, while saying that this figure would improve to 2% for next year. Meanwhile, for the Asian region, the bank has revised its forecast for economic growth to 4.9%, which is 0.1% higher than previously projected in December, and inflation is expected to come to 3.2% in 2024 before gradually easing to 3% in 2025. As for risk factors to economic growth, the ADB cited geopolitical instability in the Middle East, uncertainties of the monetary policy in the United States, as well as the unstable real estate market in China. Yoon, Arirang News.
And trade figures for the first quarter of this year show Korea's hybrid vehicles leading a remarkable performance on the export front. Our Park Gonu has more.
South Korea has recorded a record-breaking Q1 for automobile exports in terms of value. According to data released by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Thursday, total exports came to $17.5 billion, or nearly 24 trillion won, up 2.7% on year. The value of outbound shipments in March alone rebounded to just under $6.2 billion after a drop of $1.05 billion was recorded in February from the month before. The rise was mainly attributed to growth in hybrid vehicles. The value of hybrid car exports in March jumped 37% on year to a record high $0.85 billion. In terms of domestic sales of hybrid cars, more than 40,000 units were sold in March, an on-year increase of 23.6%, despite domestic sales of all vehicles falling by 12% last month. Sales of electric vehicles were also up by 15.5% on year, with total domestic sales of so-called green cars up 18.6% last month. And 365,000 cars were produced in March, higher than 2023's monthly average of 354,000, but down 10% from the same month last year. The industry ministry said decreased production was due in part to fewer working days and construction at one of Kia's factories. The industry ministry also said it would work to ensure a robust performance for the auto industry in 2024 to mirror last year, when outbound shipments worth nearly $71 billion were seen. Park Gon-woo, Arirang News.
In other news, prospects of a slash in interest rates this summer by the U.S. Federal Reserve have been rendered unlikely. Our Moon Hye-ryun explains.
U.S. Federal Reserve officials are concerned that inflation isn't coming down fast enough, and traders now expect rate cuts later in the year than originally forecast. On Wednesday, the Fed released the minutes from its latest meeting in March, which saw another freeze in the U.S. benchmark interest rates in the range of 5.25 and 5.5%. The meeting notes revealed a more pessimistic stance towards rate cuts from policymakers, citing uncertainties in being able to lower inflation towards the Fed's 2% target. Some participants reportedly predicted that longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, with others commenting that geopolitical risks could result in higher energy prices. After expectations that interest rates would be lowered in June, economists now predict that rate cuts could come in the Fed's meeting scheduled in September, given this latest commentary. The sentiment was supported by the U.S. Consumer Price Index for March announced by the Labor Department on the same day, showing that consumer prices rose 3.5% compared to the same month the year before. This is in fact higher than the 3.2% on-year rise seen in February. It's also the highest rise since last September, supporting Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments that it's a sometimes bumpy road to bring inflation down. With the U.S. CPI seeing 3 straight months of high readings, experts are saying that this might not just be businesses raising prices at the start of the year as economists had previously argued. Following the Fed's meeting notes, U.S. President Joe Biden acknowledged that while there could be delays in interest rate cuts, he stood by his prediction that these cuts could come by the end of the year. Moon Hye-ryun, Arirang News.
On a light note now, Korean authors of children's books are looking to expand their fan base as they partake in a leading book fair over in Italy. Our Choi Seong shares their story.
Recently, the international reputation of Korean books and authors has been growing. In Italy, at the Bologna Children's Book Fair 2024, the largest children's book exhibition in the world, many Korean children's book authors are invited to show their works to the world. The Culture Ministry in South Korea has doubled the Korean author exhibition space at the fair compared to last year. So, 18 Korean children's book authors can meet overseas readers and publishing companies in person to promote their work. At this year's Bologna Book Fair, Korean picture book author Kim Ji-an, who won the Bologna Ragazzi Award Comics for Early Readers with As You Drive, shared her thoughts about the pure joy to be found in her book.
Regardless of the situation, we should be able to run with joy as our engine and fuel, and the ones who understand this joy the best are the child readers. We adults should help continue building a society where children can experience joy.
For 40 years, the Korean children's book author Lee Geumi has been comforting children and teenagers with numerous books.
Children's life experiences like school may be different by country, but feelings of joy and sorrow and challenges are universally shared. I hope my work can bring them some comfort and give children some faith in humanity and hope for the world.
The 62-year-old was listed among the final 6 nominees for the Hans Christian Andersen Award, the highest award in children's literature. The award, presented every 2 years since 1956 by the International Board on Books for Young People, evaluates the lifetime achievements of children's book authors worldwide. The announcement was made on Monday local time at the fair, even though Austrian author Heinz Janisch won the award. He said she was proud of being a finalist.
It's an honor that judges showed interest in Korean literature for children. I hope this sparks more awareness of Korean children's books worldwide. I feel proud to be able to take a small part in spreading awareness.
The government plans to strengthen the global expansion of K-picture books through appropriate local support initiative. The Bologna Children's Book Fair 2024 will run until April 11th. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
Pet plants are emerging as popular companions among office workers and others here amid the hustle and bustle of city life. Our Chung Eun-jo covers this trend.
Inside a round glass container are stones, moss, and small plants. This is easy to maintain as it only requires spraying water once a week.
I started bringing plants to the office to relieve the stuffiness and for interior decoration. The greenery has helped alleviate my fatigue and stress.
More people are choosing to raise companion plants or pet plants instead of pet animals. People can enjoy plants through terrariums, which are plants grown in glass containers without additional expense or noise. Pet plant kits that are available include native moss and ferns to create a small garden, or allow people to place succulents on top of wood with its natural green visible. People can enjoy carrying a small plant in a small stainless steel container that resembles a lunchbox. The types of pet plants that were previously limited to orchids or potted pines in the past are becoming more diverse to include moss, air-purifying plants, and succulents.
Companion plants is a new term that means to gain comfort by communicating with plants like friends, and goes beyond the traditional hobby concept. More people are seeking comfort by raising pet plants after the COVID-19 pandemic.
In a satisfaction survey about life with pet plants, over 90% of respondents said it helped alleviate depression and loneliness. Reflecting such situations, sales of companion plant-related products in 2023 increased more than 8-fold compared to 2020. This indicates that the number of people who cherish and care for plants as they would for pets is growing. Chung Eun-jo, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's a cloudy day for most parts of the country with some rain. Rain is going away in the capital, while Gangwon-do province could see rain through the late afternoon. Meanwhile, Jeolla-do provinces and Jeju will see a passing rain during the day today. It really won't rain much with 1 to 5 millimeters of sprinkles in the forecast. But brace for strong winds and thunderstorms if you're in Jeolla-do and nearby areas today. Today's rain will not help much to ease the dryness in the air, with a dry advisory remaining in place for Seoul and surrounding areas. Wet clouds will just hide the sunshine behind the clouds, but southeast regions could see a glimpse of sunny skies, and daytime highs are similar to yesterday, hovering around 20 degrees Celsius in most parts of the country. But sunshine and warmth return tomorrow, and by Sunday, Seoul will see a high of 27 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, rain is in the forecast for Jeju from tomorrow into Sunday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour here in Korea. We return with our panel session in a few minutes, so do stay with us.
It has very good energy. I also think it has a very good message. And also I want to know what happened later with the band.
저는 너무 별로네요. 내 기타 어딨냐고.
Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
South Korea's 22nd parliamentary election came to a close on Wednesday, with the country's liberal opposition parties taking the helm of the National Assembly. So what appears to have affected voter sentiment? What are the implications of this election result on the Yoon administration's agenda? And what has been the response from the foreign media? Welcome to Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min San-hee. Today I have our panel of foreign journalists for their take on the results of Korea's latest parliamentary race. For this, I have Jack Barton here in the studio. Jack, it's great to have you back.
It is great to be back.
I also have Andres Sanchez-Brown with us. Andres, welcome back.
Thank you for having us here, as always.
Jack, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with your thoughts regarding the result of this latest parliamentary election here in the country. Was the result largely expected, do you think?
I think so. You know, opinion polls and analysts are often notoriously unreliable, but we had seen for months leading up to this that there was an expectation the Democratic Party would either retain their majority or build upon it, or as one analyst I spoke to just before the election, you know, we're going to have a landslide, a tepid victory or something in between, but we're not going to have the People Power Party come out with a majority. And what we got was that something in between result. So a stronger position than the Democratic Party had before, but not perhaps the landslide they were hoping for. In a sense, of course, this is terrible news for the government. It's going to make it very hard for President Yoon to move forward with his domestic agenda over the remaining 3 years of his single-term presidency. And of course, he's already come out and publicly said that he has heard the verdict and that he will alter policies accordingly. But even if he alters policies, it's going to be hard to move forward with that domestic agenda. If there is any good news for the government, it is that the opposition didn't manage to get the 2/3 majority, or that with the other parties to get that 200 seats, which would have given them a very powerful veto, the ability to change the constitution and the ability to impeach the president. And there's no doubt some people, and I can think of Cho Guk, the head of the Rebuilding Korea Party, who would very much like to have pushed for that. So, you know, whatever relief, perhaps a measure of relief for the government can be gained for that. But yeah, now it leaves South Korea in a position where, you know, we have geopolitical risks around the world and in the region. We have economic problems all around the world. And South Korea finds itself in the unenviable position of political paralysis for the next 3 years. But perhaps that's better than the chaos that might have ensued with a more than 2/3 majority.
Right. And Andreas, what are some of your takeaways from the result of this latest parliamentary election?
Well, I think that in the end, the coverage that we've been doing, and especially in the last few weeks right before people hit the polls, have basically focused on what more and more analysts were saying and pointing to, that this was going to be some sort of referendum regarding what the Yoon government has done in its first 2 years in power. And but I mean, the main takeaway is that the voters have punished the government, finally, as we've seen. But as Jack has pointed out, this punishment has not been as harsh as some of the latest surveys were pointing out. Some of them were pointing to that 2/3 majority in Parliament. So it could have been much worse. And I agree, I totally agree, for the sakes of government stability and national stability, to have a situation where the opposition would have had, you know, the ability to circumvent presidential vetoes, but most importantly, the ability to impeach the president. And as Jack pointed out, I'm thinking of parties like the one that Cho Guk leads. Basically, they've run their campaign over the slogan, 3 years is way too long. Basically, their goal was to reach that impeachment. But once again, it's good that Korea is not going to be in such a troublesome situation. But all in all, the message still is that the Korean people seem not to be happy at all with the government. In that regard, it's also good, I think, if we take a little step back and also gain some perspective. Right now, not many, I can't think of mostly any developed economy that has a government that is widely supported by the people. If you know, think about it, think about the US, think about the UK, think about France, think about Japan, or even my own country, Spain, has governments that are definitely not widely supported and are facing challenges that are pretty similar if you think about it. High inflation, low economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. So at this point, I think this is one thing about globalization in that sense, where governments are, in advanced economies, are facing uphill terms and facing very similar challenges.
All right, then, expanding perhaps on what Andres has just said, Jack, what factors? Is it just simply the livelihoods perhaps that played a decisive factor in pushing forth voter sentiment based on the result of this latest race?
I think there's a few things here. One of them obviously is the economy. The other thing is perhaps perceptions about Yoon's personality in governance. but I think honestly, the main factor, if I look at it, is if we look at the overall campaign, and we're talking about both parties here, heading into these elections, we can call it negative partisanship. So partisanship being you would normally support your own party or the policies, or we're seeing a mirroring of what's happening in the United States and other countries, in that you almost begin to forget what your own party is doing and you just attack the opposition. It all becomes about attacking the opposition. The one thing we didn't hear anything really of was policy in this, so we can't really say, well, it's about this or that. Actually, the Korean economy, compared to other economies, is doing pretty well. We heard earlier in the report, the growth figures out. The fact is, inflation, yes, we have it, but compared to the United States or Europe, it's been managed really well. Part of that is the Moon Jae-in government's handling of the pandemic, because the inflation is really coming out of that. It's the factories shutting down, money building up. So at the end of the pandemic, you have all this money pouring out, seeking goods that aren't there. But then the Yoon government has also carried on that with the deregulation and the right response coming out the other end. So South Korea, under both administrations, have done very well handling the inflation issue. But people don't really get that bigger picture, and that's because the policies weren't explained. And I heard a lot of people complaining about that afterwards. Okay, we voted this way, but to be honest, this was terrible. This was terrible campaigning. Is this the direction that South Korea is going in now? And it does seem to be, and it seems to be an international phenomena. And I would say the Democratic Party did a better job with their Judgment Day campaigning of sort of demonizing the government than perhaps the ruling party did of demonizing the opposition, because that's what it came down to. And I think that's terrible, because it needs to get back to policy. That's what government should be about. And if it can't be about policy, if it can only be about name-calling and mudslinging, to a degree, democracy is broken, and that's never a good thing at any time.
Right, of course not. Andres, do you suppose that the priority within the minds of the voters was about their party affiliation and not necessarily the policies? Because quite a number of our foreign journalists have been saying that there was not a lot of clarity on the policies being pursued by the two parties.
I could not agree more with Jack. We haven't really heard about policies. Not from the opposition, not from the ruling party. What we've heard is basically parties demonizing each other. And when I've come to ask people, for example, about, Cho-kuk's party has become the third most voted party, even though they only run on the proportional system. But they've taken so much of this so-called punishment vote, which is when I was talking to people who voted for him, they were clearly implying, I don't really like Cho-kuk, but all I want is to punish the government, and he's up for that task. So I totally agree on what you just said. We are forgetting about what policies of the parties that we're supposed to be voting for, and just willing to punish, in this case, the ruling party. I think, of course, some issues like the inflation that has taken a toll on everybody's lives, but then again, that is basically the situation all around the world. Or, for example, the lack of affordable homes, which is an underlying problem in Korea. This government has failed to solve it so far, but so have all these governments that we're talking about. Look at the UK, look at the US, look at Europe, look at Japan, etc. If you pair this with in my opinion, a feeling that people had regarding the government as feeling, let's say, distant, I think they've deemed that the government was not really looking into people's problems. They were distant. They were not connecting with people. And once again, communication has been, I think, pretty deficient in this case. Then there's other issues, and I'm still waiting for figures to see if this happened or not. But for example, once again, we have in Korea a very large pay gap when it comes to in terms of gender. We knew this before, and the last figures have shown that Korea is still the last one among OECD economies where this pay gap between men and women is huge. And we do know that President Yoon had actually promised to dismantle the Ministry of Family and Gender Equality, which he hasn't effectively in the end, but this ministry has been running without a minister since February. I'm assuming that what we're going to see is, for example, many women in their 20s or 30s that have definitely not voted for the ruling party. That's one specific problem I think maybe the ruling party should look into and reflect now.
Right. And even well before the result of this particular election, Jack, quite a number of foreign media covered on the voter sentiment here in Korea, running very deep voter discontentment, that would be. This is something that Andreas talked about as well, and mentioned that it's not just here in Korea, but also in the UK, in the US and neighboring Japan as well. What do you believe is behind this public sentiment, broadly speaking?
We're in a tough time globally at the moment. There's no doubt about it. You know, we've come out the back of the pandemic, and for reasons we were talking about earlier, we have big inflation. Again, compared to the United States, it's not that bad. We talk about onions here in South Korea. That's been a big focus in the local media and in the international media, sort of the price of onions, and perhaps President Yoon's gaffe of going in and saying these are reasonably priced when he was talking about government subsidized onions as opposed to the ones out in the real market, which are 4 or 5 times more expensive. But you know, I think, yes, there are genuine concerns about the economy, the way there are everywhere, and perhaps an expectation the government can do more than it can quickly, which is difficult when you have the war in Ukraine, pushing up petroleum prices, you know, adding to those issues coming out of the pandemic. We now have sort of conflicts raging in the Middle East, you know, threatening to not just Russian oil, also cutting off oil coming through the Suez Canal, and we have all of these other issues, and everybody's feeling it all around the world. But of course, everyone's looking at their government and going, fix this now. And we can't go back to 1999, unfortunately. That's the reality. But I think also, you know, we've seen a focus on Yoon's style of governance. Whether it's right or wrong, perhaps there hasn't been as good a communication as there could have been. I think recently he gave that speech about why they've pursued the doctors' strategy, and it was a good communication. I think there should have been more of that earlier on. More clear communication with the people, giving a sense of pre-thinking out policy more and explaining the government's position. I think Yoon is finally settling into that role as president and getting a sense of what it is as a president you actually need to deliver. But as we've seen from the National Assembly result, that's come a bit late. And there should have been a bit more of that earlier on. And of course, some of the issues with the First Lady, with the handbag, the designer handbag, there's been a lot of foreign media attention on that, you know, receiving a gift that, yes, she shouldn't have received. But honestly, as an outsider's perspective, if that's one of the worst issues you can come up with an argument to impeach the president, that's a storm in a teacup. You know, there are bigger issues at stake here. So all of that, you know, there's all of that in the mix. But I think it's an unfortunate chapter at the moment, and hopefully there is some soul searching after this, and some some tough questions with the government looking, okay, how do we go forward? But also citizens going, we shouldn't put up with all this negative campaigning. We need to get back into policies. We need to get in a positive direction. And the best way to achieve that is to debate and talk about what the country needs to be doing rather than pointing fingers.
Right, needs to be doing in terms of moving forward then, Andres. And that being said, to what extent do you see President Yoon Suk-yeol's domestic agenda being affected by the result of the latest race?
Well, to be honest, the government's domestic agenda was already a little compromised because it never had control of the National Assembly. And right now, this election just is going to make things more difficult. As we pointed out, the ruling party, I think, lost, 9 seats, 9 MPs, whereas the DP earned extra 19. This is going to make things more difficult. We've heard the government already saying that it's going to reflect, that it's going to take the results in a humble way. We've heard the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo offering to resign, taking responsibility for the bad election results, together with 3 presidential aides, including the Chief of Staff. Of course, there's the signaling there, but we need to see what's going to happen in the next few months. Is the government going to keep to try railroading legislation, through administrative orders, or is it going to try and compromise a little more with the opposition, which in this case, I would personally think it's the better way of doing things right now. Because unfortunately, even though there's no two-thirds majority in this case, it only takes around 10 of your MPs right now to change their minds and try to impeach you. You never know. But for the sake of stability, I think compromise is probably, and positive thinking, as Jack just mentioned, try to actually talk through your own policies and focus less on demonizing your opponent. But as I say, the next months to come will tell us what these 3 years could be. Maybe very long for the sitting government. We'll see about that.
Right. And what about you, Jack? Do you see the result of this race perhaps affecting to a great extent President Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy?
I don't think so. The domestic agenda definitely, as Andres just said, will be affected. And I agree totally that it's time for compromise, in order for stability. But I don't think foreign policy will be greatly affected. Obviously, even under the Democratic Party government, there is a close security arrangement with the United States. Perhaps not as close, they would like to see it not as close as President Yoon has pushed that relationship, and they would certainly perhaps like to see more outreach with North Korea and a softer tone with China, but it's nuanced. We're talking about policy nuance. It's the one area there's not too much disagreement. The policy with Japan is something else, and we've seen, even Lee Jae-myung, the opposition leader, going on a hunger strike at one point over the government's policy regarding the Fukushima water release. The government's pushing for much stronger relations with Japan, security-wise, but also rebuilding the economic links, which I think in these difficult times, I personally believe is a good idea. But I don't think, there's not too many ways that you can push back against that foreign policy. So I think in terms of what the government has been trying to achieve, South Korea is a global pivotal state, a stronger alliance with like-minded nations, closer ties again with Japan in terms of security and economy, and the deeper defense relationship with the United States, all of that will continue pretty much as it has for the first part of the term, I imagine.
Right. Right then, Andres, as you mentioned, compromise with the opposition party will be important for the ruling party as well as the government, as well as Jack talking about the need for better communication with the public. All that being said, what else can you tell us about the urgent tasks that need to be tackled by the government? Well, we were mentioning inflation before. We were mentioning the economy, or to quote the Clinton campaign of '92, right? It's the economy, stupid. But then again, which government in all these countries that we've been talking about has the key to solve any of these issues? I don't know, right? But to think of one urgent task would probably be the doctor strike that you mentioned, and yes, I think that it was a little too late when the government started signaling that they were, willing to compromise at some level with the doctors. But anyhow, I think we all either have some underlying health issues or know people that have them, family, friends, etc., that have been affected by this doctor strike, which has lasted for almost 2 months, right? And of course, this is one thing that needs to be solved right away, tackled right away. And once again, once we see what the votes by gender, etc., age groups look like, maybe tend to the gender gap issue once again, because I have the feeling that many women of certain age did not like the government's policies in this respect. So one thing to look at, definitely. Right, then we'll have to wait and see. All right, as always, Andres, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Jack, thank you very much for your insights.
Always a pleasure. Right,
well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.